Bernie, I'll just start by saying, thank you so much for giving up some of your really precious time to join us on The Responsible Edge this morning. I know you and I connected kind of pre-Christmas, and I was really excited for this conversation. So really appreciate you coming on.
Pleasure. Yeah, happy to do it.
And Bernie, I know we've got a particularly a nuanced kind of conversation to have today on the basis that you're an author and you've recently published a book which we're going to be talking about in a bit more detail later on during the conversation. But over the next kind of 20 minutes or so, we're going to try and give our listeners, those that aren't aware of your work, a real flavor as to your background and your experience and the things that you've done so far in your career and what you're hoping to do with the rest of it. So start wherever you would like. I'd like to go back to the sort of the formation of things, if you like, and really get a sense of those formative experiences. But just talk us through, the sort of professional life that you've led, and in particular the role that kind of corporate ethics, responsibility, and sustainability has played in you doing what you've done.
Okay, so we'll get to that. I was born on a chicken farm in the U.S. in New Jersey. My father was an egg farmer, so that was my early years living on a farm. Moved to New York City, went to New York City, what are called public schools, but New York City school system. Went to university, decided to study chemistry. For no particular reason. I just knew I wanted to do something scientific. Chemistry seemed like a good option. It turned out to be a wonderful one for me. I became a chemist in the sort of 1960s, early 1960s. I had a chance just at the end of my undergraduate career, at my last year, to do a research project. And before that, I wasn't sure. You go to classes, wasn't sure what chemistry was about or what I would do with all the knowledge that was being stuffed into me. But once I started doing research, I realized that I loved it, and I would learn new things just because I wanted to understand how things worked and what I was doing, et cetera. And I just loved doing research. So I immediately decided I wanted to do a PhD. Before that, I thought maybe I'll go to medical school or something of that sort. But I decided I would do a PhD in chemistry. Did it with a man who I became as an advisor, who I became very close to. I was probably closer to him than I was to my own father, really. We were so deep friendship, worked together for 4 years while I was doing my degree, but I would see him very regularly for the rest of his life, really. Mm-hmm. And again, I just loved research. And then I was sort of on a natural course to get an academic job, and I did. I went to work at City University of New York, which is an enormous university, 250,000 students spread over 20 campuses, but with a small group at one of the colleges and at the City University Graduate Center in New York. So I had a rather conventional beginning. That is, I got some grants from the government and from private sources. The American Cancer Society sponsored my work for a while. I picked out some areas of research that I really wanted to do, particularly on how cell membranes worked and trying to understand these from a kind of physical chemistry point of view, and maybe how drugs affected them, how did cholesterol affect red blood cells, things of that sort. Mm-hmm. But really, it was very fundamental science that I was doing, and it was published in basic journals. So I loved working with graduate students, PhD students, but I also loved teaching undergraduates. I did a lot of undergraduate teaching, basic chemistry, and I loved doing that. And some of my colleagues and I collaborated on things, and we saw places where textbooks were not explaining things properly and wrote articles to say, wait, here's how this book is telling you that diamond and doesn't explain why diamond and graphite are both carbon and are different from a fundamental point of view. We can explain that. Here's how it works. So things of that sort. I
Mhm.
love that. And I
And
also,
Bernie, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're in full flight. What was it that you loved about it? Was it your experience that you had? You mentioned your sort of mentor and the academic that you were working with earlier in your career as a student yourself, as you were doing your PhD. Did that experience really affect your eagerness to help other young people, other younger sort of students, if you like, that were going through a similar experience? Or what was it that drew you to that teaching element?
in fact, good question. In fact, it was not my research mentor who particularly inspired that, but as many people do when you're doing a PhD, you work as a teaching assistant with another faculty member in a course. It's part of the way that that you get your stipend or support as a student. And I worked with a man named Robert Livingston, who was a great scientist, but also a great teacher. And he inspired me a lot on teaching. And he said to me, "Look, when you teach students and when you give grades to students on how they have done. You have their lives in your hands." And he took this so seriously. He believed that was what really inspired me as a teacher, to try and be clear and to try and develop these young people. And we had wonderful groups of students. Really, it was really enjoyable. And what came back from the students to you
Mm.
was just great. Not every day, and you do it for year after year, and it's hard to keep fresh, but that's a challenge as well. So I love the teaching. I also did a couple of other things while I was a faculty member that were uh, important. One was uh, I did some work to help uh, high school teachers of chemistry. What here would be sort of GCSE or A level
Mhm.
uh, chemistry, uh, do that job better. Uh, and I I had teachers come and spend the summer with me, uh, and we would talk about how to do things better. And then they do make little films. It was films at that time to help other teachers learn how to do things in the classroom that would be just facilitate improving the quality of this. And the, the teachers were so appreciative of this work, and I enjoyed doing it. The other thing, and this came a little bit later, but it was part of my academic non traditional career, was uh, at the other extreme from young students. Uh, I got involved because there was a program that the National Science Foundation was running for in what were called reentry women in science. Women get lots of bachelor's degrees in chemistry and biology and mathematics. In fact, women get half the bachelor's degrees in mathematics in most countries, but
Wow.
2% of the PhDs. So we have all these women who were well educated in science and mathematics, but they weren't working at it. And the question was, could we bring them back? Could we develop a program to bring them back into the scientific work and engineering workforce? And so, along with several friends at other universities, we developed a whole series of these programs, and they were called Reentry Women in Science. I did two of them, one in polymer science, plastics, polymers, synthetic materials, and another one in computer science. And I'm talking about computer science in the uh, late 1970s.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
and many of these women went on to very successful careers, and it was a very fulfilling thing to do.
Mhm.
So I did those things, and finally, what in my academic career, I was always publishing papers and doing science, but At one point, and when I was still at City University, I was uh, elected by my peers, by the fellow faculty members, as chair of the department, of the chemistry department. Uh, and in many universities, the chairman or chairwoman or chair is appointed by the dean, but in fact, at this university, it was democracy. So I was elected. I didn't win everybody's vote, but I got a chance to try out my skills at leadership and watch how other people were doing things.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that led to me being recruited by another university, which at that time was a very, very old engineering university, which you have in the U.S., uh, called Polytechnic Institute. It was founded in the 1860s, is now
Mm-hmm.
part of New York University. It's the Tandon School of NYU. Uh, and they recruited me as Dean of Arts and Sciences, which was a proper management role. Uh, I said, yes, but I'm going to still do my science and still do my programs for women and so on. And they said, great. Uh, and and then while I was there, they created a position called Vice President for Research, which I took on. I ran an institute founded by private donors and sponsored by industry. So I got both management experience and also I was uh, I was doing things connected to industry and meeting leaders from companies like Xerox and Fujifilm and Kodak and IBM and working with them on things. So uh,
And Bernie, sorry to interrupt you, but that experience of moving to the new university and taking on a leadership role and being exposed to industry, like what was that? Were you like a duck to water, or were there like major things for you to sort of learn and tailor about your approach? That being a sort of an academic and having worked in that area for so long, being successful, but what were the kind of key things that you had to learn and develop about yourself in order to take on those new roles?
absolutely, you learn every day. And I looked at the people around me, the president of the university, the provost, the vice president for finance, so on. And I said, I tried to always look, and I had coaching in this as well from people. I tried to always look and see what is this guy doing
Mm.
that I really admire, and how do I do this myself? I wasn't taking any courses. Nobody was training me, but you can do that if you're alert to what's going on. And I also looked at what is this guy doing that I don't admire? Because you see leaders who lie, uh, who uh, don't make decisions, who don't speak well. And I tried to sort out these things and learn and improve every day and listen and ask people for feedback. So, yeah, I had a lot to learn. And I was just learning the beginnings of how to be an executive. But in a university, an executive job is quite different from industry, which I'll get to in a second, because in a university, the professors are quite autonomous, uh, and you're not their boss. Uh, you have to work in a way that gets them. If you want to do something and you want their help, you have to persuade them rather than tell them. Uh, there's no hierarchy in the sense that they have to pay any attention to. And that, I think, was good training for how I behaved when I moved to a proper industrial job. So, in after I had been a university professor and had various leadership roles for 18 years, I had published lots of papers. I got some awards for my research. It was all good. One day, I was at a conference, a scientific conference, and some people from Standard Oil of Ohio, who I knew very well. I had worked with them. Uh, we even had written a book together. Uh, they said, let's go out to lunch. Now, it's not unusual. They would often take me out like that. And while we're out to lunch, they offered me a job. They said, why don't you come to work for us? Because we need some leadership at the research center, and we don't have anyone in your sort of age range. There are some older people and some younger people because we've expanded recently, but we need somebody like you who knows the science, who's respected, and so on. And because they were quite wise, after we discussed this for a bit, they said, "Look, you don't have to make up your mind in the next 2 weeks about this. Here's what we'll do. We'll make you a consultant to the company. You come out, you get to know people, know what we do. People will get to know you, and you'll get paid for this as well." And so I would come out for 1 day a month, and they would send me reports, etc. And gradually we got to know each other. And finally, I just said, and there are complications in these things because if you have a professional wife, as I did, uh, you have to find 2 jobs, etc. But finally, I just thought, well, I've never worked in industry for a day in my life. Uh, I can always go back to an academic role. Let me try this and see if it's fun. And so I picked up and moved. I had tenure, which meant nobody could fire me in the university, had no such job security in industry. Fine. I wasn't really insecure about that.
Hmm.
And that, in a way, is when I really did find it was like a duck to water, uh, because I was really interested in the kinds of problems these people were tackling, which were very diverse, uh, and how we could really make an impact on the company and on the industry as a whole. Uh, so I went to work for this company, which was the original Standard Oil company
Hmm.
in Ohio. I didn't love living in Ohio, but because I was a New York City kid. Uh, but uh, again, I found research areas that were of interest to me. I developed a bit of a reputation for the work that I was doing and that my group was doing there. Uh, Still had plenty of external visibility, and uh, I what well, the big thing that happened with the company was when I joined, it was already half owned by BP.
Hmm.
Uh, that's a result of some complex things related to oil in Alaska, actually. But BP then, within a year after I joined, moved to buy the rest of the company, and they did. Uh, and the people who were leading the company from BP said, "Look," approached me and said, "Look, we want you to run the research center." I was running one part of it,
Wow.
uh, and I had had already 2 jobs in 2 years because that's what happens in industry sometimes. Uh, and they said, "We want you to run uh, this whole research center. You've got to get to know how we do things and so on. So, would you go to England for 2 years, take up a role there, and then come back?" And I said, "Sure." And that's why I'm still here after 35 years. Uh, because I came over, I did one job, I did another job. They said, "Well, really, there's a better job here for you that we could use you for here rather than go back to the US." And uh, various things led to other jobs. So I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of roles that I took on here because they became quite consequential for other things in my life. Uh,
Bernie,
so
Bernie, can I
please,
just
please do.
interrupt you before we go on there? First of all, you clearly liked coming live in the UK more than Ohio, if you've ended up sticking around for 30 odd years. But well, we're not belittling Ohio here. But I must ask you, you went from working in research, working within the academic sort of institutions that you worked for, running research projects. You were then running research and ultimately running the whole research initiative for BP, as you're going to come on and tell us. But what was the major difference for you in terms of the experience of research within an industry context versus working in academia?
Okay, so from the research point of view, it's completely different, or it should be completely different, uh, in that the only reason we do basic science in industry is because it's important for a business goal that we
Hmm.
have. Uh, Here's an example. If you're exploring for oil, and people aren't doing that so much anymore, but if you are exploring for oil, you have to understand the geology of the subsurface, what's below the ground. And that's done by a lot of seismic probing and all sorts of other technologies that have developed over the years. Well, it's you the companies that are going to be successful really understand how the mathematics of that seismic processing, how it works, where are artifacts, etc., so that they they can do the ultimate goal of finding oil successfully. You
Hmm.
only do basic science because it feeds the goal, but it is important to do it. Uh, and we'll come on to this later, but for example, when you develop a new chemical process or petrochemical process, say making higher octane uh, petrol, for example,
Hmm.
uh, or low sulfur diesel, which we worked on. You develop the process and then you get to a certain point and it's a commercial process and you can roll it out and use it. We all did that. So Ohio, Standard Oil of Ohio had a process for making a basic material called acrylonitrile, which is used in building block of acrylic fibers.
Okay.
Very, very successful. Paid for all the profits from that, paid for all the research that the company ever did
Right.
over decades. But when you roll it out, it's only the beginning. It's not the end. A mistake that some industrial leaders make is who don't know science and engineering think, okay, now we've got this commercial process, let's do something else. No, what you've got is is version 0 of this. And
Hmm.
now you can make it really effective, make it really high quality, uh, drive down costs, improve the quality of the products, etc. So that's why you do the research at all, both to create new things that are commercial and which is not an academic aim at all,
Hmm.
and secondly to really improve these and improve the way we do things.
Fascinating, Bernie. Fascinating. Thank you for giving us that insight. That sort of iterative improvement of the process that's been initially sort of substantiated in the initial piece of research. That makes absolute sense. I want to ask you one more question before we talk about the rest of your the next stage of your career here in the UK. When you joined, Standard Oil, were you aware of, or did you have any kind of preconceived ideas around, the impact of the oil and gas industry from an environment perspective? Was that even on your radar at that time? And if it was, like, what were your views and perspectives on that?
I would say it was not much on my radar, and we're talking about the mid 1980s here. Uh, what I did ha- what we were very concerned about were things like spills.
Hmm.
So that's I guess I would say we were concerned about uh, environmental impacts that were direct from
Hmm.
what we did, rather than the ones that came from, say, our customers using the product. Uh, and there was a, a whole set of environmental regulation that we worked within. So you run a chemical plant or an oil refinery, uh, you have a whole set of regulations that you have to abide by and permits that you have to get and so on. And we I had a group, in fact, when I first joined the company on environment that was working for me, but that was what they were concerned about. How do we comply with these regulations? So we always wanted to uh, be complying with the law. And this is sort of the big change that occurred in my life over the, I'm going to come back to other roles, but in my life over the next uh, decade or so,
Hmm.
because the attitude within BP at that time changed from we always comply with the law to we have to continuously reduce our emissions.
Hmm.
And that is a very big difference. It's still about local issues, our own emissions, even when we started taking up the whole issue of climate change, it was about the emissions from our own operations
Hmm.
rather than our customers' emissions from using our products. But that uh, was the change, which is a huge mindset change.
Hmm.
I'll just say it again. Instead of saying we always comply with the law, and there are still oil companies out there that have that as their principle. You want us to change what we do environmentally? Make a law. We'll comply with the law. They lobby against it, but uh, we'll comply with the law. It's a huge difference from to go from that to saying we have to continuously reduce our emissions. It's part of our permit to operate, our license to operate is that we are trying to do better. Uh, and I think we were one of the first to make that change, but and many others followed, but not everyone. So I I had a variety of roles in BP, both in technology leadership. So I was initially the technology leader for the refining and marketing business, which is a huge business.
Hmm.
Uh, all of the refineries, all of the filling stations, the the products that we sell. I was at one point head of the products division. Uh, and then uh, I also had a senior business role that was given to me in the early 1990s, which was people taking a chance on me because I hadn't had a major business role of running the whole refining business for the world, which is an enormous business and wasn't one that was making very much money at the time. So uh, there were plenty of challenges to do there. So I learned a lot about business and how to measure success, how to change what you want to achieve, uh, and change people. So learning about how to change is
Mm.
very important in industry because it's easy to keep going where you are and just make incremental differences. But if you want to really uh, reset things, you have to drive big change, and that's a very important competency that people have to learn.
And clearly something, Bernie, that when you look at the different stages of your career, there, as you've described, there have been these sort of big moments, if you like, of, putting yourself into scenarios and situations where you yourself have had to adapt and had to significantly change the way that you view yourself and the work that you're doing and learn, as you've alluded to. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating that there's that commonality throughout your career.
So
Bernie,
I
this
have
is
to change, but also I have to drive
a
change.
drive change, of course, and inspire change in other people, as you alluded
Exactly.
to way back in terms of the work that you did with some of your students back in your academic days. Bernie, I just want to check in with you. I'm finding this absolutely fascinating. I'm sure our listeners are
Let's
as
do
well. But we are absolutely obliterating our normal timescales on things. Are you
Okay.
happy for us to carry on, though? I'm
I'm
fascinated.
happy to carry on, but I speed up a little bit.
No,
Uh,
no, no. This is brilliant. This is absolutely
okay.
brilliant. So just talk us through. I think we're now, you've mentioned a number of the kind of more senior, more sort of business focused roles that you're taking on at BP. Just talk us through kind of what happens next in terms of your career from
Right.
that point
So,
onwards.
so two key roles at the end of my time in BP, which was somewhat accidentally exactly the same as my academic time, 18 years.
Oh
Uh,
well.
the One day, John Brown and Rodney Chase, who were the CEO and deputy CEO of the company, called me in and said, "Look, we want to do something significant on climate change and on clean fuels." Uh, I had been involved with uh, negotiations in Europe about uh, fuel quality and so on. I represented the company on a lot of European uh, legislation issues. Uh, and uh, uh, Really, what they were saying, although it took a while to get this to be said explicitly, is we're going to change environmental issues in this company from a compliance issue into a strategic issue.
Hmm.
What if we said, yes, there's legislation on reducing the amount of sulfur in diesel that will come into effect in 10 years? What could we do next year about this? Step out from the industry and do something soon. Uh, then becomes a strategic issue because if cities or countries want to have cleaner fuels, cleaner, and this is associated with air quality, uh, how do we, how can we do this and grab business away from our competitors? So, and I had been managing this huge business, uh, 14 refineries around the world. I had 450 staff working for me. Uh, Suddenly, I went from that to having 3 people uh, and just thinking about what we could do. But when you have hundreds of people working for you, you you are worrying all the time about organizational issues and management issues and so on. When you have 3 people, you can actually think, and when you can think, you can have influence in a company that wants to do something. You can have influence, and so BP was a great company because you could work by influence as well as by hierarchy. And so we developed a program. Uh, 2 programs, one on climate change, again on reducing our own emissions, and another program on clean fuels. And I led both of those. And that's completely changed my view because it brought me into contact with a different community. It led me to start thinking about things like sustainable development. And but just at the beginning, uh, and I have to say at that time, I didn't really know what sustainable development was. Uh, I was thinking about it mostly about as an environmental issue. And just to wrap up my time in BP, a few years before I left, uh, John Brown created for me the post of chief scientist of BP. Nobody had that role before. There were people leading aspects of the technology programs, but again, uh, this was the senior scientific role. There was a chief scientist and a chief economist,
Hmm.
and we really could have influence on the direction of the corporation. So, real influence uh, on how things went and how we approached various issues. And really, my mission was that was given to me was what can affect this company. What in the world of science can affect this company on any time frame, say from now to 15 years from now, and what should we do about it? And you're the person who has to do it. So I set up research centers for us in at Cambridge, in uh, various places in the U.S. One of which is still going on climate change at Princeton University. Uh, I set up a research center in China for BP. Uh, at various universities. I got to learn a lot about how China was approaching science and so on. So I did a lot of things, and I set up a joint venture for BP in biofuels with DuPont.
Hmm.
It was not just universities, but also industry. So it was a terrific job. And I thought, well, at a certain age, I want to do other things, and now's the time to leave. So I
And,
I chose when I wanted to leave.
and Bernie, it's been so fascinating, as I say, to get that kind of the stage by stage, and we're going to come on to talk about what happens next. But reflecting on your time at BP, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here and throw at you a probably fairly ill-informed opinion, but an opinion I think that a lot of people hold, if you like, when they think about traditional oil and gas companies. Like, reflecting on your time at BP and thinking about what's happened to the company since, like, what would you say to people that suggest that, an oil and gas company like that investing in clean technologies and looking at alternatives and investing in, a chief scientist role and initiatives like you've described, that suggests that, at the core and the fundamental heart of BP is an organization which is fundamentally, damaging the environment and unsustainable. Like, what would you say to those sorts of people that would have that opinion of a company like that?
Um, I think that you start in a certain place, which we were, but in the 1980s, uh, oil and gas, yes, it had some environmental regulation, but largely unconstrained. Uh, People wanting more cars, bigger cars, almost driving trucks instead of
Tanks.
cars, especially in the US. Uh, the enormous pent up demand from Eastern Europe to Russia to China for and Africa for more personal mobility. And if you are there, you have to think, how the hell can we move this whole gigantic enterprise with all this pent up demand as well as existing thing into some other place?
Mm.
Uh, because it became clear that the environmental impact was enormous. And by the time we got to the late 1990s, which is the time we're talking about, anybody scientifically literate would understand that climate change was accelerating and was going to be the major problem that had to be dealt with. We still haven't dealt with it, but we understood that, uh, and at least we said something about it and did something about it, not just said, "Okay, tell us what to do and we'll do it." So
Mm.
I, I, I think the company had a lot, did a lot right, but it also did a lot wrong. Uh, and because we were very successful at that time, the company became very arrogant. And it's a
Mm.
danger when you're a very successful business that you become very arrogant. And that's what led to things like the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. Uh, was I think arrogance. We can do anything. We're so great.
And
Does that help address your
it
question?
does, it
How,
does, but sorry, buddy. It absolutely does. I think it would just be remiss of me not to pose the question of you. And I totally understand that,
absolutely.
what you've done and the impact that you had there. Ultimately, it's that classic, description of a huge oil tanker, and now we need to start, turning the thing, and ultimately the
In this
difficult.
case, it actually is the oil
Well,
tanker.
there you go. It is an oil tanker, exactly. But Bernie, let's move on. So you leave BP. What do you do next?
Uh, I left BP and I wanted to do a few things, and I have done most of them, not all. Uh, First of all, I wanted to do venture capital because people were talking at that time in the early 2000s about how these guys have a different way of doing business. And so, with some friends from California who approached me, uh, guys, they were mostly friends of friends. We said that they had been doing the usual software kinds of things and so on, and healthcare, venture capital. But they said, how about helping us raise a clean tech fund? We'll
Mm.
invest in some new kind of companies. Uh, and we raised a lot of money, initially $250 million, then 450 million not long after that. So we had a fair amount of money to invest. And we invested in a lot of different things, new solar technologies. Uh, we were the first investors in Tesla, and we did a lot of work on electric cars. We invested in uh, things that related to biofuels. It wasn't clear whether that was going to be an important thing. And uh, I learned the good and the bad about venture capital. Uh, there's again a lot of arrogance there. Some of it justified, some not. Uh, but I at least got to see companies from the early stage and how some of these things grew and why they failed as well.
Mhm.
Try to understand why they failed. And I did venture capital both for both with Vantage Point in California, clean tech fund, and also with some groups in the UK subsequently. I'm still involved in early stage angel investing now. Uh, so also with a climate. So everything I've done in venture investing has been energy and climate change, really. So that's been one big theme for me in the last 20 years. In my sort of third career. The second has been that I've done a lot of boards. Uh, and I think I learned something when I was in BP about how companies work and how they should be governed. And I've been on the boards of companies like Severn Trent, the water company, uh, I, which was very interesting for a while. I chaired three UK public companies, uh, uh, smaller ones, some of them technology based, a lot having to do with energy and environment. Uh, and I still am active on corporate boards. So I'm interested in governance and how companies are governed, and we may come back to this a little later. And um, and then I also have taken on some roles with the government, both the US government, not so much. I was on the board of something called Argonne National Lab, and I was involved with the US Department of Energy and its research programs. That was a natural thing. But just when I was leaving BP, Jonathan Porritt, who's a great UK environmental leader and an inspiration to me, called me and asked me whether I would consider joining something called the UK Sustainable Development Commission. Uh, and it was a couple of years old. Tony Blair had established it, and he was rethinking how it worked. He had been the chairman of it from the beginning, uh, but he wanted me to be commissioner for energy and climate change. And there was a commissioner for education, for buildings and housing, things of this sort. And that was how he rejigged it. And that was a transformative experience for me
Mm.
because I managed to learn. And I think that it wasn't just me, but other members of the commission learn what sustainable development was. We called it the Sustainable Development Commission, but what is that? And I think that's something that we should talk about here. It's very much a theme of your podcast because too often people equate sustainable development with environmental protection
Hmm.
or even climate change. They say, "Oh, yeah, sustainable development. That's climate change, isn't it?" No, it's not. That it, the climate change is an enormous, important issue. All other environmental issues, biodiversity, etc., important issues, but sustainable development is much more than that.
Hmm.
And that's what I learned as we worked together in the Sustainable Development Commission, that it is about, yes, it's about living within environmental limits, which is the way I would put it, but it's also about building a sustainable economy, building a healthy and just society, ensuring that governance is participative and that people can participate in government using science responsibly. All of this is sustainable development. So it is a set of principles,
Mm.
really, that can help you make choices. And that's why sustainable development is something that can work in a capitalist society because even capitalist societies have to make choices. Uh, what do we, and we see this in the government here all the time now. Today, as we're recording this, in today's paper, it says that the chancellor is considering authorizing a third runway for Heathrow because she believes that it will drive economic growth. Well, that's a choice.
Mhm.
And we can ask, with the principles of sustainable development that I've talked about here, uh, is that a choice that's consistent,
Mm.
those principles? Or are there other choices which are better to achieve the goal of a prosperous economy that she's trying to achieve? Uh, and so this was a really important role for me. Uh,
Mhm.
I worked with great people in the Sustainable Development Commission, both staff and and fellow commissioners. And I think we had some impact on the UK government in terms of reports that we did on the Severn Barrage, tidal power, uh, on wind power in the UK, showing the potential for this, on Ofgem as a regulator and whether they were uh, working for the good of society and the consumers or not. Uh, and it formed the basis for me to do other government roles because I then took on the role of chair of the Office of Renewable Energy in what was then the Department of Energy and Climate Change.
Mm.
And there I had a chance to really drive uh, the program forward. And uh, really, I think that we laid the basis for all of the offshore wind work development that's gone on since then. So uh, both the venture capital, business boards, government roles. And I'm going to end this longish uh, career summary by saying I have a hobby, if I can call it that, of writing books. Uh, so in 2015, I published a book on leadership called Crash Course, uh, 52 short essays on leadership, which has a lot of companies have taken up and used as one of their corporate books, and people tell me that it influences them. In 2019, I published a book called Solving Chemistry, which is about having a research career in chemistry and what happened in chemistry during the 20th century. Uh, it was somewhat controversial, but it turns out it's become a much used book by A-level chemistry students in the UK, learning about whether they want to become chemists and what happened in chemistry. And most recently, uh, a book called The Material Advantage.
Which Bernie will come on to talk about in a moment. I want to ask you one final question. You mentioned the introduction to your career and to your experience. That was absolutely fantastic, and I'm so pleased that you went into the depth and the detail that you did, because I think for anybody listening in, it's going to be a fascinating insight into somebody of your sort of experience and significance, and the roles that the different segues and the different sort of
Mm-hmm.
moments of inspiration and change that occurred throughout your career. Let me ask you one final question though on you. As you look back on what you've done in sort of totality, and I know this is a difficult question to answer, but what do you want to when you get to the end of your career? What do you want to be able to say about what you've done?
I think that what I would say is that there were a few moments could be years, but there were a few times when I got to work on things which actually made a big difference. Uh, so when we did clean fuels, uh, we were affecting a whole industry, and the air quality of Istanbul, the air quality of Atlanta, the air quality of Detroit. I worked on those kinds of things. Company that I'm involved with now on the board is doing things which affect the air quality of Mexico City, one of the most uh, unbreathable places. So I think just a few of those things, what we did on wind power, think that if you can be remembered for having had a few of those impacts, that's more than most people can ask for.
Here, Bernie, and I think the way that you've described what you've done, to date, it's evident that you've had a really significant impact. Let's move on, though. We've done 50 minutes on you, which is beyond what normally an episode covers. So I hope
Okay.
it's okay if we carry on, and now talk a little bit about the material advantage. Would you start, Bernie, by just giving our listeners a bit of a synopsis and a summary, if you like, of the book, and perhaps pick out for you what are the most interesting points that you'd like to discuss, during the next sort of 20 minutes or so?
So let's start with a question. Why are there rich countries and poor countries? And why do some countries that uh, are poor become quite wealthy and successful, and other countries that are quite successful sink into something sort of average? Here's an example, or let me give two examples. One is, in the 1950s, South Korea was a poor country devastated by war and with very little in the way of natural resources, and an enemy, a border, not clear what was going to happen. Last year, the GDP per capita per person in South Korea passed that of Japan. South Korea is one of the richest countries in the world today. Uh, Now, there are African countries, Ghana, several others, that became independent just at the same time as we're talking about from South Korea in the 1950s. And they are still relatively poor countries. Why is that? It's not the people. There are ambitious, smart people everywhere. There must be other reasons and conditions and decisions that people made that make this difference happen. Uh, the material advantage tries to look at one lens, look through one lens on this, and that is a way that countries have achieved advantage and sustained it over decades, centuries, even many centuries, is by the ability to transform raw materials into manufactured materials. So if you have raw materials, usually you just get exploited, uh, and you don't. But pump, if you mine gold, uh, or mine some valuable ore out, you don't increase national wealth. You have the money from selling the ore, but you have less ore. So
Mm-hmm.
the national wealth is the same. Same thing with oil producing countries. But if you can take that ore, that raw material, and transform it into something valuable that other people want, whether it's people in your own country or people in other countries, then you really have something. And that's how countries have been competitive against and competitively advantaged against their neighbors and globally over time. And I try to explore this in the material advantage through some examples. So, kind of, here's a set of propositions. Uh, these novel materials, when you combine them with capital and skill at manufacturing, can give you competitive advantage through several different routes. So, first of all, it can strengthen the ability of the society to prosper through better access to cheap materials. So, in countries that make aluminium, products from aluminium, there are lots of industries, cars, airplanes, lots of different things that have grown up to all the way to food packaging that uh, that have helped countries prosper because they have access to cheap materials. Second is you produce something valuable far in excess of what your internal needs are. That generates wealth that flows into the country, and you can use that wealth to develop new sources of advantage. So, this is the Industrial Revolution, isn't it? Britain never grew any cotton, but it dominated the manufacture of cotton clothing of all sorts for 2 centuries. And it used the money from exporting clothing for lots of things. Some of them we admire, better education system in the country and so on, but also conquering and maintaining empire.
Hmm.
Third, of course, people employ materials for superior armaments or technologies to support military operations. Now, isn't just armor, it's things like bandages. Bandages are a materials story. Um, Fourth, using the advantage of material availability to produce public goods, which in turn convey advantage. So, public goods are things that are free or almost free to use and don't get used up, like the highway, the motorway system, or the electricity grid. Uh, and there are materials that are at the center of the electricity grid. All those cables that you see going from one place to another uh, are materials. Fifth, if you have a vibrant scientific research and engineering thing, and you encourage entrepreneurship, well, you start with one new material, and then you get many different. Science and engineering gives you many different uses.
Hmm.
So uh, you start with a basic electricity grid and light bulbs, and before you know it, you have microwave ovens and air fryers. Uh, and and finally, you get advantage, and this brings us back to where we were before, by living according to the principles of sustainable development, by
Hmm.
which I mean all the things I've said, living within environmental limits, etc. For example, low cost clothing, which is a material story, means a more equal society. If people can afford to dress in a certain way, they can get access to certain jobs. There was a time when the cost of dressing yourself up meant that uh, if you were in a particular place in society, you could never get access to the next level.
Hmm.
Cheap newspapers, which is also a material story, mean a better informed population, which should lead to better government, and so on. So that's what this book is about. And it tells us through a lot of stories about materials over time. And it tries to make the case that these principles uh, are still important in our so called globalized society today.
Well, Bernie, that was going to be. I've got two questions for you, and I want to come on to. I'll delay that second one that you've just inspired from that comment until later. But can you just take us back to South Korea and describing perhaps within the context of what you've just gone through, what happened to South Korea from the 50s onwards to enable them to be as successful as they have been?
First thing that they did in the 1950s was they said, we are going to have to put in place as good an educational system as anybody has in the world. And the way to do that is not to flail about at all levels, but to start with primary education.
Hmm.
What do we need to do? How do we need to educate people at primary school level? And let's make that as high a standard as possible. And then they moved up and moved that through so that you got over time a cohort coming through and more behind them of highly educated people. Uh, you know, sorry, let me stick with South Korea so I answer your question because I can get diverted. The second thing was to say, okay, what are industries where we could be successful? Uh, and they realized quite early on that if you start with a lot of small stuff, you will, you might get there, but you might just wind up with a lot of small businesses for a long time.
Mm.
Uh, but what if we tried to focus on a few particular things, certain electronics things, some plastics things, and so on, and build those up to scale?
Hmm.
So, can the government, working with industry, build companies at big scale? And that's what they did. Now, they engaged in some practices which people thought were unfair competition. They priced stuff lower than uh, they really needed to because they wanted to drive other people out of the business. But they
Hmm.
were very, very strong. They had a very strong competitive mindset. So they built a big an high quality education, which was fundamental, and then a desire to build big businesses rather than be a nation of shopkeepers.
Bernie, would it be fair to? I mean, from what you described there, there's a sense of they looked at what they could specialize in, what niches could they particularly thrive within, and instead of sort of spreading themselves too thin. That's super interesting. Let me ask you. I want to bring you back to the comment that you made before about how the book within the material advantage is obviously a reflection upon some of these themes and some of these sort of observable patterns in terms of development of countries and of industry over time. Looking forward and thinking about the application of the principles within the book into the sort of the world that we have right now and looking into the future, where do you see this notion of kind of material advantage applying as we move forward? I mean, in terms of new materials, etc., in terms of new battlegrounds, if you like, for success. What does that look like?
I'd like to integrate that a little bit with what we was talking about on sustainable development before
Mhm.
and environmental issues, because uh, one of the great triumphs of materials over several centuries was food packaging.
Mhm.
Until the early 1800s, the only foods that could be preserved were things that could be salted or uh, cured in some way.
Mhm.
Uh, then in the 1800s, canning was a food was invented. Uh, Various places, but England had a very big role in this, uh, and because we had the materials expertise to coat tin onto steel or iron. Tin cans are not made out of tin, but tin coating. It
Mhm.
was a material story. But sorry, but today food packaging is out of control. Uh, you go into any supermarket and you can see this. Uh, mo- the materials that are used in crisp packets are not recyclable. Uh, while food packaging initially made an enormous impact on reducing food waste, food packaging today is increasing food waste because if you go to a lot of shops, supermarkets, you can't buy two tomatoes. You have to buy four or six because they're packaged up and sealed. So there's packaging that's going to be thrown away, and then food that gets wasted. Uh, why does every cucumber have to have a polyethylene shrink wrap on it? It makes no sense at all. So we need to find a way uh, to completely rethink food packaging, which is a material story, and greatly reduce the amount of material. So dematerialization is one thing. Second thing, a big source of waste is in building and construction. Uh, a huge amount of what goes to landfill in this country is because when they go to construct a house or a big building or so, they buy much more than is needed,
Mhm.
and and then various bits get scrapped, and you'll see skips and all sorts of other things hauling this away to landfill, and it's taking good material and reducing it to a bad form.
Mhm.
Uh, the country that can make building and construction waste disappear or mostly disappear will be tremendously advantaged because it's complete waste of material. There's a company in the UK now getting impact in lots of places called QFlow, started by two brilliant young women civil engineers uh, who are doing just this, helping builders, uh, big ones, in fact, reduce the amount of waste that they. Uh, Other things like 3D printing are inherently reduction in waste because when we make a something by subtractive manufacturing, which is the way we do it, we cut away stuff, and then what's cut away is waste. When you build it up, that reduces waste. So I think throughout society there are a lot of possibilities for waste reduction, not just recycling, but reducing waste that will lead to advantage.
And hence the
Uh,
material advantage moving forward as we
exactly.
sort of look towards the future. Bernie, I'm gonna have to. I know we've literally just touched the surface when it comes to the
Right.
book. I would say that we'll obviously link to the Amazon links, etc., for our listeners to check the book out. I, for one, would suggest going and having a read of this because it's absolutely fascinating. And Bernie's only been able to sort of, as I say, sort of touch on the tip of the iceberg, if you like, in terms of the insights that can be gleaned in that book. So, but Benny, let me finish by asking you the magic wand question, which I'm fascinated to hear what your response to this might be. But Bernie, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I think what I would go for is the following. I would like to see a lot of corporations be governed in a completely different way. So instead of selecting board members from the great and the good of society, uh, and I think that we could try a model where the customers of a company became the governance of the company. And they govern in the interest of their total uh, impact, the total impact of the company. Uh, the easiest place to start this is with utilities. Uh, so water companies should not be governed by boards made of people like me. I mean, Severn Trent is not even where I live. So, uh, but, but it should be governed by the customers, the water customers, and Thames Water should be governed by its customers. But I think that could apply to a lot of companies uh, more broadly. So my magic wand would be to completely change how we govern companies so that they're not governed by the employees. That doesn't make uh, quite sense. We have to look at the impact, the overall impact of the company, and that is to govern by the customers.
Which ultimately, drawing it to the themes that we've discussed in terms of sustainable development, would allow for that 360, holistic, nuanced interpretation of what a good decision for that organization actually looks like when it's touching upon all of these different facets. So, if I've understood you, Bernie, from the conversation today, I think that's an excellent magic wand suggestion, if I may say so, and one that we've not had before, which is always good to hear. Bernie,
Excellent.
thank you so much for giving us such a fascinating, deep, rich, conversation around the things that you've done in your career so far and the impact of the work that you're doing now. It's been absolutely fascinating. I hope my listeners have appreciated the fact that I've sort of shut up and allowed you just to flow, which has been brilliant. Would love to have you back on if you've not totally and not enjoyed the experience. But Bernie, thank you so much for today. It's been great.
Pleasure.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to our fantastic guest, Bernie Bulkin, for joining me for today's show. Bernie is a visionary in sustainable energy and material innovation and has had roles ranging from chief scientist at BP to chairman of VH Global Sustainable Energy Opportunities. And I have to say, we had a very, very interesting conversation that went way outside the scope of our normal format, and really looked at Bernie's latest book, The Material Advantage, and some of the themes that were of particular interest within his book, which we'll link to in all of our materials. In particular, we delved into how material innovation has shaped economies for centuries and explored the potential of future materials to drive sustainable development, aligning profitability with resource conservation. So a really fascinating conversation. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, promoting responsible corporate communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. See you next time.